Andy just raised questions about that are kind of, for all our enthusiasm and engagement and toil and study and teaching in this area, we still kind of have a way to go in understanding just what the stakes are that we're aiming for. What outcomes do we want to measure? I mean, and this is a lovely way qualitative and quantitative work can work together, is the sense that a measure is only as good as the way we describe the phenomenon in the first place. If we haven't described a phenomenon very well, we've got no hope of measuring it well. And of course that also challenges us to say, well, you know, what are the outcomes we're most interested in? And in this area, of course, they're multiple. There are health outcomes, social justice and security outcomes, educational outcomes, and again, you know, it becomes all slippery and hard to pin down. You'll be grateful that I'm not going to try and cover it all, but it is an exercise in trying to do one angle well, with just a few slides showing you a case study of a research we did with a service provider for people with intellectual disabilities, partly funded by that service provider and partly funded by the CRC for Interaction Design. And its aim was to understand better the mechanisms that produce for us, and the angle in our project was, among all the outcomes, one of the things that was important to us by virtue of the project was the role of the digital in promoting cultural participation. I mean, there's a lot of burgeoning research now which says that in fact participation in culture, in music, arts and so on, is actually very good for people in a whole range of ways, including social capital, social connections, their sense of liveliness and well-being and so on. And so we were very interested in just how the digital world might actually maximise cultural participation for people with intellectual disabilities. Now, this is an intensive study. It's not statistically generalisable, but it's a preliminary study which would help us start to map and measure precisely those relationships. Okay, this is the only slide with lots of text on it, but it's very important text. It's an excerpt from an article that I found which employs conversation analysis, and conversation analysis is very good at in the fine detail of conversations, where if you're to do it honestly, you've got to document silence as well as the spoken word. And this was a study of people with intellectual disability and conversation. And as you read, you'll see that in fact in the conversation analytic tradition, those silences were understood, and coinciding with those silences were all kinds of non-vocal gestures on the part of the people with intellectual disabilities that ought to have counted for interaction, but were not noticed. It's a very poignant and powerful kind of granular story about recognition and the dynamics that produce it or not. And of course it tells a story about the way the vocal world privileges some over others. This was actually fundamental in our enthusiasm for our project. Does this go on to the full slide or?
No. Well,
oh, sorry. All right.
Yeah.
Okay. Another key for us in our motivation was the UN Commission on the World Commission on Culture and Development, auspiced by Javier Perez de Cuellar. And it was very, very strong and remains a very strong platform for our work. Espousing the value that culture is for everybody. It is not just secondary or the stuff other people worry about. It is fundamental to well-being. that everybody needs to have a voice to be able to flourish and express themselves to the full.
No.
Oh, sorry. Okay, a third kind of influence on us was a burgeoning and very good literature in the geographies of intellectual and learning disabilities, where careful research has shown that, in fact, when people with intellectual disabilities are asked about what their aspirations are, there comes up this idea of alternative zones of inclusion, in the sense that they're not saying but participation for us doesn't mean throwing us out into a world where we're completely vulnerable and possibly not noticed, nor does it mean hidden away privately. In between that, it means that we ought to be able to create the contexts in which we feel that we're in charge of it, that we can actually prescribe what's normal, where we can shape the way things are going on. And the two graphics you see there are, in fact, two digital art kind of little signatures of the people with intellectual disabilities that we visited. The green one is the Incredible Hulk. That was his name, or the name he gave himself. And the other was the Purple Lady. Two little pieces of digital art that then became their signatures. So, I mean, in a sense, it signifies the role, or starts to give you a taste of the role of the digital in identity, in creating identities that are known and recognised and understood. So, if those are kind of the values, the broad backdrop to what we were interested in, what were our insights into the role of the digital in creating cultural participation or enhancing it? One of the key theorists in sociology in relation to the field of cultural participation is Pierre Bourdieu, and he said that the cultural field has an entry fee. Now, if you're serious about people participating, you need to see what that entry fee is and address it. For him, it was the aesthetic disposition. Core to the aesthetic disposition is the capacity to exert control over the form of a work. So that while you might write a letter to a friend or an email, just how are you going, and so on, is just prose. But the more you craft the words and move them around in order to create some special form of expression, the more you exert aesthetic influence. It was our observation that, in fact, this is one area where people with intellectual disabilities, the ones we studied and who helped us and collaborated with us, they had enormous enthusiasm for. And in particular here you see an example of their work with a digital music, how would you describe it? It was system, a digital music system that had already existing kind of styles and so on in it, but plenty, a very complicated and complex set of things that could be varied. You could bring the drums in or out, the guitar in or out. You could vary the timbre and the density of the sound and so on. Lots, and the support workers said, look, this is just so complicated. We just don't know that they're going to be able to deal with that. But of course they relished the complexity. Whether I sat down there, or they sat down there, or anybody sat down there, there was no option but to try it, to see how it worked, to see what you liked, to gradually get used to it to the point where you can start to shape the sound that you wanted. And so, of course, this was a digital platform that allowed them to engage in music jamming or as Marmont and Johnson call it, the happy science of the moment. The important thing about that is that it is emergent rather than prescribed. It's